Hey guys, how you doing? I'm in the middle of another project here, but I've got the front end kind of torn apart, and I've been wanting to do this to the Bug for a while. So I figure while I've got this all tore apart, this is a perfect time to do it. What I want to go over is, if you've got a coil spring like this, and more than likely you've got dual coil springs stacked on it, and then those coil springs are going to be different spring rates. Now, with these coil springs and the spring rates, you've got this slider ring which goes between the bottom coil and the top coil. Your bottom coil is going to be the stronger coil of the two. The top one's going to be the softer in most applications. Now also bear in mind, I'm not a professional racer or anything like that. I'm just telling you how I set them up, and I'm giving you some of my tips. You take it with a grain of salt. Use it if you want to use it, or do it your way. I don't really care. I'm just letting you know how I do it. Now in my situation here, I've got a 10-inch 200-pound spring, and then I've got a 10-inch 100-pound spring. Now on this suspension, I have a lot of sag. So when I set my chassis down, my suspension is really soft. I've got a lot of droop, and I don't want to ride around with the suspension compressed a lot. So I would say at least half of my suspension is just sag. So when I'm sitting there, my top spring, which is the 100-pound spring, is really compressed a lot. And that's how it needs to be, and that's how I want it. I'm just doing some slow mountain trail driving, and I want it to be a soft ride with a lot of travel. But what I want to show you guys is I've got roughly a 10-inch shock here. It has exactly 9.5 inches of travel. So no matter what's going on, this shock is going to be utilizing 9.5 inches of travel. Now what you have to take into account is with your springs, and they're all different. Your springs have a length, which on this one is 10 inches, and then they have a compressed height, which on this one is like 3.27 inches. And that means when this spring is completely compressed, it will be 3.27 inches tall. And then they have the stroke, which is the remaining 10 inches after it's compressed. So if it's 3.27 inches, then the stroke is something like 6.7 or something. Now, that's how much this spring can actually travel. Now, just so you know, I've got these two springs, and the heavier spring is made out of a thicker metal, obviously because it's stronger. But their length is both 10 inches. The heavier spring has a little bit higher stack height. It's like this one was 6.25. It's like 6.3 or something. Anyways, just to keep it simple, in my head, I just figure these have a 3.5-inch stack height, both of them. Now, if you allow it to be a little bit thicker, that's okay, because that means if you set this up for 3.5 inches, you're going to be okay. On this spring, you absolutely cannot go lower than 3.27, because that means your spring is actually going to be bound. I actually wouldn't recommend going any more than 3.5, because you want a little bit of slack in there just for a safety margin. So just so we know, both of these springs are 10-inch. I'm assuming both of them have a 3.5-inch stack height, which will give both of them 6.5 inches of travel. So what that means is I have 6.5, 13 inches of travel between my two springs, sorry. However, my shock is only utilizing 9.5 inches. So what that means is, if I didn't set my slider, then my two springs, because they're capable of 13 inches, most of the compression would happen on my 100-pound spring, because this spring is going to completely collapse before my 200-pound spring does. Well, if this completely collapses, this one will never collapse because these have 13 inches of travel, yet this shock is only going to utilize 9.5. Now, in in my suspension system, and this is where everybody's going to be absolutely different, I want this lightweight 100-pound spring to handle the suspension at the drop end, so that I have some soft suspension. But it's so soft, I want the full effect of this 200-pound spring, so that if I'm actually driving a little bit aggressive, that 200-pound spring can kick in as much as it possibly can before I hit the bump stops. Now there's a lot of ways to do that, and it's all based on math, and that's awesome. You have to, take a look at where you've set your ride height with your collars, and you have to add up your stack heights and all that. But in a situation like this, where I just want to get as much as I possibly can out of my lower spring, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my slider, I'm going to take my spring, or my shock absorber, and I'm going to compress it all the way. Now this would be absolutely maximum compression. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't even get this far because my bump stop kicks in at a little over ½ inch. But just to play it safe, I'm going to put this spring all the way in, so it's utilized its 9½ inches of travel. Now, my 200-pound spring, which is the bottom spring, I'm telling you, it has a 3.5-inch stack height. So that means that in order to get everything out of this 200-pound spring, I need to set my slider here so that, oh crap, from the bottom of my spring retainer at full compression, I need to be 3.5 inches, which would be right there. And in order to do that, I would slide this collar. Oh, that's going to take a while. I would slide this all the way down. I don't know if you can see this on the video. There's the two collars up top that set your ride height or the spring height. And then underneath that, there should be some sort of dual locking collars or something that are much smaller than the spring collars. Those are meant for the slider here. Okay, so now I've got that set. And I'm at 3 5/8, so I need to come down a little farther. Okay, that's 3.5. That's 3.5 inches. Now, what that means is my bottom spring is going to be doing every ounce of work that it can when this spring is at full compression. Because what this collar is going to do, let me double check that one more time. Came up a little bit. Okay, that's 3.5. It's a little bit more, which is fine. Of course, hopefully you guys realize that if you're doing this, you're going to have to let the nitrogen out of your shocks, because you can't push it in and just hold it like this if you don't have the nitrogen taken out of your shocks, so keep that in mind. So now at full compression, my bottom spring is going to be a little over 3.5 inches. So full compression, it's going to be doing everything that it possibly can. Yet, my top spring at full compression is going to be right around 6.5 inches. So what that means is at full compression, this spring, the lighter spring, the 100-pound spring, is not going to be doing everything that it's capable of, because these collars are going to make this stop traveling, which is going to make this upper spring stop traveling. It won't really be doing anything anymore. At that point, this lower spring, which is the stronger spring, is going to kick in and do everything that it can. Now, in some situations, depending on what your suspension setup is, you might want it the opposite way. You might want it so that your top spring, your softer spring, is actually doing everything that it can, and your lower spring, your heavier spring, kicks in a little bit later. If that was the case, then I would set the distance between here and the top of my collars at 3.5 inches, because that would let the top spring do all of its work, and then the bottom spring would never actually kick in, do everything that it was capable of. So I hope that makes some sense. I'm just trying to show you guys how I do it. Like I said, I'm not racing the Baja 500. This is just me working in my garage on a Bug, on vehicles that I tool around on the mountain trails. But take that for what it's worth. Think about it. If you got any questions, let me know. I hope it helps you guys out. Thanks for watching.